we'll get started.
So, how do you prepare?
Carry on.
First of all, why are we talking about this, and why is it relevant?
This is a great question. Has anyone in this room ever felt that you have been hurt by another person? Hands up. Okay. Have you ever felt sad because of another person? Because of something that they've done or they've said? Okay. So the reason that's happened is probably, most likely, I'm not going to speak for you, but it's probably because of attachment. And so if you want to avoid that experience, if you want to avoid having that experience where you are hurt by someone, by something that they've done or something that they've said, where in spite of feeling close to someone or wanting to be close to someone, you're still having these sort of unpleasant experiences in your relationships. The way to do that is basically what we want to do is move from attachment to love. And so this is a really relevant thing for all of us, because the reason that we feel hurt and that we feel, that people have wronged us a lot of the time is because we are operating from a place of attachment rather than love. And so it is important that all of us understand, what those things are and what they mean and how they're relevant for us in our relationships.
You bring up the sort of attachment and love, and you make a very good distinction between the two. But then, what exactly is the difference between love and attachment?
So it's pretty simple. The difference between love and attachment is that love is about the other person and attachment is about me, right? In any relationship, when I'm more focused on myself and what I'm getting from the other person and what I expect from the other person, then most likely I'm functioning from a place of attachment. If I'm thinking about the other person, right, not about myself, if I'm thinking about what I can give to them, how I can serve them, or how I can make their life better. In other words, when we see selfishness, it's most likely that there is attachment, right? And when we see that we are more selfless and we have the ability to give, then that's an indicator of love, right? So that's one way of looking at it, is selfish versus selfless. The other way to look at it is what's the result of attachment versus love? So the result of attachment is dependence, right? Basically what happens is we become dependent on the other person. And the result of love is that we become independent, but we also make the other person independent. You've probably seen the difference between these two things in your own personal relationships, right? You've seen that there are people whom you connect with, and when you are with them or when you talk to them, you feel more confident in yourself, or you feel more like yourself, right? You feel better equipped to be you and to pursue the things that you love. And at the same time, there are people who maybe we enjoy spending time with, but who don't necessarily leave us with this feeling of, that we have this great potential in life, but who leave us feeling that when they're there, then everything's okay, but when they're not there, then we're lost, right? That's that dependency that gets created. And that's like a pretty good indication of attachment.
You've given a very good example of indicators for both love and attachment. But if we are to focus a little bit more on the love aspect, we know what an indicator of love looks like. Mm-hmm. What is a measure of love, in your opinion?
So the measure of love, and this is what, Gurudev mentions as, so he talks about what is love and how do you measure love. And he says the clearest measure of love is our capacity to give. Our capacity to not only give, but also to sacrifice, right? When you're really ready to not only give, but you're ready to give up for the sake of the thing that you love or the person that you love or the cause or the ideal that you love, that is a really great indicator. And we see this, right? Like when you have love for example, our parents, right? The first few years of our life is all about really kind of taking from our parents, right? We're receiving. But eventually we reach a stage where we start asking this question, like, what can I give? Because we start recognizing the sacrifices they've made. We start recognizing everything that they've done for us to be where we are today. And so when I have that kind of, when that capacity grows, right, to give, but also that sensitivity of like, what can I give, right? It's not just about giving, but it's about feeling that I want to contribute, that I don't just want to keep taking and taking and taking. That sensitivity is an indicator of love. So it's not just about giving, it's about developing that kind of desire to give. And also the capacity to give up something, right? Like a lot of people of South Asian heritage are susceptible to things like diabetes, right? Sorry, that's just the and so that means like avoiding certain food. And we are, if not known for anything else, I think we are generally known for our love for food. Like maybe not everyone who comes from India, but like, certain states. I can speak for myself. I'm Gujarati. We're definitely known for our like love of food. Ritvik, I don't know about you, but
you're playing it very safe now. Right. So
okay, my example is I haven't finished. The example is if you love someone, right, and they have to like, say someone has diabetes, they have to give up eating sweet food, right? And say you really love sweet food, but but say because you are, part of the same household or whatever it is, it's easier for the other person if you also give up that thing that they can't have, right? So the measure of that sacrifice that you're willing to make, giving up sweet stuff is like a really simple example, right? When it comes down to it. But if you think about the sacrifices that our parents or grandparents made, right? Leaving their homes, moving to a different country, to a different continent where like they didn't know anyone, going with no kind of safety net, no backup plan. Why did they do all of that? It's with like future generations in mind, right? It is for that love for whoever is coming next, for them to have better and better opportunities. Huge sacrifices were made. So that is, that's like the measure, right? That's the measure of love, is how much am I willing to give up?
I like this example more than the sweets.
Yeah.
All right. So how do we overcome attachment then? From the first point that you had made, where you were talking about attachment, love, indicators of love and attachment, measure of love. So how do we overcome attachment when we know that's not what we're supposed to be doing?
So there's two ways of thinking about it, right? Like if I recognize I've become dependent on a thing, so we go back to the food example, or or say you recognize you become dependent on coffee, right? How do you remove that dependence? So one way of doing it is you just don't keep that thing near you, right? So say you think, I want to stop drinking coffee in the morning. You don't the next day go to the supermarket and buy loads of coffee and keep it in your kitchen and then think, no, but I won't have it tomorrow, right? If you want to give it up, you don't buy it. You just don't keep it there, because then there's no opportunity for your mind to make an excuse and make it and then drink it, right? So one way of giving up attachment, of like weaning ourselves off this kind of dependence that we have, is to just kind of stay away. Sometimes you can do that with people, right? You become attached and you recognize that this relationship is not healthy, it's not helpful, it is not serving either person. You stay away. Sometimes you can't do that, right? Sometimes you cannot avoid seeing the person, interacting with them. So then how do you give up that attachment if you're still having to kind of see that person on a regular basis, talk to them? The way that we are guided to do that is by developing love, right? So it's about shifting that attachment to love. How do you do that? So a great example, and most of us in this room are not necessarily parents, but this is a really great example, right? A lot of the time we think being parents and loving children means protecting children and not letting anything bad happen to them, right? But imagine a parent who is so scared of their child falling that they don't even let them learn to walk. That's where we go wrong, right? In attachment. So it's knowing that if I really want the best for this person, I have to let go a little bit. I have to step back, right? And so it's learning to do that. It is figuring out how I can change that pattern of my thinking, and start thinking again, how can I give, right? How can I support? How can I contribute? Rather than, what do I expect from this person? What do I want from them? And what do I want to kind of, what am I taking from them? So it's learning to ask ourselves different questions. It is recognizing that with attachment, there is like this particular kind of narrative that we have in our head, recognizing it and learning to change it and shift it so that we move the dial into love and independence rather than dependence.
I want to touch upon a word that you used a couple of times as you were talking about, the topic. You used dependence quite a bit. But, examples that I can think of where a dependency sort of needed is, we need money in our day-to-day life to operate in society the way it is currently set up. Our body needs food, we are dependent on that. So is it okay to be dependent on things, or is it just not okay, or is there some middle ground?
There's a difference, right? There is a difference between the kind of physical, practical dependence that we have on things in our life and the mental dependence that we have. So physically, to survive, we need food, right? That's not something that anybody will deny. But it's not true that physically to survive, I need only a particular type of food from my favorite restaurant or whatever, or only food cooked by this person who's cooking that I like, only a particular type of cuisine. Really speaking, to survive, we could all survive on like pretty simple food, right? But nobody's gonna go home and eat boiled vegetables with like a little bit of salt and pepper or whatever it is. No one's gonna do that because we like having nice food. But the reality is we don't need it. Okay? It's a nice thing to have. It makes us feel better about our lives. Say you've had like a really bad day in the office, or you've had a challenging meeting or whatever it is. Food is like something to look forward to for a lot of people, right? So it becomes a dependence, because then it's a way for me to make myself feel better. But it's not something that I need to physically survive, right? So there is a difference between like a physical dependence. We live in like a really expensive city, so we need money. You need money to pay rent, you need money to pay your bills, you need money to buy groceries, you need money to travel, whatever it is. But there is an amount that you need, and there is an amount that you want, right? And there's a difference between the two. So that kind of practical physical dependence is not something that we're saying we have to get rid of. That it's there and it will be there. The thing that we have to watch out for is that mental dependence that we develop on, I won't be happy until I have this particular type of food, or I won't be happy until, I don't know, somebody speaks to me in a particular way. If this person smiles at me or doesn't smile at me, then I can't be happy, right? We have all these conditions in our mind. So it's letting go of the mental dependence. The physical dependence can be there.
Okay. I think the next question that I have is something like a lot of us in the room can relate to quite well. So like, if we are to bring this dependency and attachment with respect to people and the relationships that we have, you mentioned earlier that it is okay to let go of, people in our lives that, I mean, it's okay to just let go of people or relationships that don't help us. But then obviously, like a lot of us struggle with doing that. How can we sort of overcome that attachment or dependency on people who are quite involved in, our day-to-day lives?
How many of you think that you are attached to people who are close to you? To people who you aren't necessarily like, you don't have close personal relationships, but who you see on a regular basis? Would you find that there are attachments there in those relationships? Yeah? No? So whether or not in those kind of peripheral relationships, we all feel that we have attachment to the people who are close to us, right? We also have love. It's not that we don't have love, but we're also like very attached, right? How do we overcome that attachment when these are people that we are seeing and interacting with all the time? So if you remove everyone else from the equation, right? So just ignore all those people. Say none of them were there. Say tomorrow you met a whole new bunch of people and they became your close personal circle, right? Do you think that you would form attachments to those people? Knowing what you know now and being who you are right now, do you think that you would form attachments again? Nothing's gonna happen to your existing, it's just an example, okay? But say tomorrow, we replaced everyone in our life, right? Do you think that we would again develop those attachments? Hands up for yes. Okay, pretty much everyone, right? Why do we tend to get attached again and again and again? When we know like the downside to it, and we know that we become dependent, and we know that it hurts us, why do we keep getting attached? So one way of solving this problem, and this Gurudev talks about in I Love You letters, right? He says, the way to deal with this is just ignore everybody else. you, independently by yourself, you just become a pillar of strength in your own life. Okay, so regardless of whoever else is with you or not with you, you just work on making yourself strong, right? And making ourselves strong means developing our spiritual strength, right? So it's practicing everything that we talk about in class. It's practicing that inquiry and really thinking about, who am I, right? It's practicing all the sadhanas that we talk about, whatever it is that, we've chosen. It is practicing in our daily life, it's practicing the attitude of karma yoga. It is practicing developing a relationship of love with the higher. All of those things contribute to make us strong, to make us individuals who can live in this world without constantly needing to lean on something or someone to get by, right? Because that's what attachment is. It's us leaning on someone because we think that we cannot survive or get by without them. So, when we think, okay, if I need to remove attachment from this relationship, then we kind of tend to think in a very, okay, what do I do with this person? And then what do I do with that person? And how do I solve it here? If we just think, okay, how do I solve it here? Right? That's all it is. It's just making myself stronger so that I don't get attached and I don't become dependent on the people around me.
So far we've been talking about situations where we're looking more inward to outward, the attachment, the relationships that we have, the connections that we have. You touch upon how do we not be dependent on other people? How do we not, try to lose that attachment? But let's flip it around and think about, there are so many instances in our life, connections that we have with people where we're not necessarily dependent on them, but they are dependent on us. Why does this happen? And how, how you've addressed, how we can sort of solve this inward to outward. How do we sort of address them not being dependent on us?
If we can help people find their own strength, then we prevent them from becoming dependent on us, right? But if we encourage them to lean on us more and more and more, in a way that stops them from recognizing their own potential and their own strength, that's where we are sort of, we make room for, and we don't disrupt that dependence. So if we go back to that parent and child example, right? How does a parent make the child independent? It is by encouraging that child to discover its own potential, right? To learn what that child can do on his or her own. So it is, it's helping people to figure out their issues and their things themselves rather than solving it for them, right? And it's so tempting when someone comes to us and asks for help to solve the problem for them, right? And to just say, okay, this is what you should do. But then what happens is the next time that problem comes up, right? And they haven't thought for themselves, they'll just come straight back to you. And if the next time you're not available, you've put them in a really bad position because now they're lost, right? And they really don't know what decision to make. So it's our responsibility to I guess, help others cultivate that strength and potential within themselves. And we can only do that if we're secure enough in ourselves to not need anyone else to depend on us. Because it feels good when people depend on us, right? We actually like that feeling. We like the feeling of people coming to us and asking for help. So we have to be secure enough in ourselves to know that we will not lose out if the people who we love become independent, right? actually it frees them up to love us even more. Because when they are, when we're in a relationship of attachment, there is a lot less freedom. Right?
That's a very interesting point you make. But does detachment play any role in love?
Detachment is what empowers love, I think, and what actually goes hand in hand with love, right? If we go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, where love is about giving and love is about the other person, I can only really think about the other person and think about giving to them if I have enough kind of detachment from my own needs and my own concerns. So love is very much, the more detached we are, actually the more greater capacity we have to love. And the more we love, the more we grow in our detachment. People often think detachment means like letting go of the people around us and like isolating ourselves, right? And being kind of aloof. But actually detachment and love go very much hand in hand. So they will support each other.
So the more detached we are, the greater the capacity to love things and people. So by that logic, is it possible to be truly selfless in love?
I think it's actually only possible to be truly selfless in love, right? Rather than in attachment. In attachment, really we can't be selfless. It's really only in love that we discover true selflessness. Because in love, our gaze really is able to kind of extend outward rather than just to be focused on ourselves.
Okay, I'm a little bit confused.
Okay.
Earlier in our conversation, you told not only me, but the entire room over here and everyone watching online, that it is okay to let go of certain relationships and not be attached to certain people. Now you made this point. And now I'm thinking like in love, isn't the right thing to do sometimes to be a little bit selfish, just in with respect to setting boundaries for yourself, ensuring that you don't get hurt, because that happens. Like in love, you can get hurt. What are your thoughts on you?
Yeah, the idea of giving, right, and giving without limits, sounds scary sometimes. Because if I'm expected to just give and give and give, then this question very naturally comes to us that what about me, right? If I keep giving and I keep taking care of the people around me, who's gonna look after me? Or even if I know that I have to look after myself, if I keep giving and giving and giving to the people around me, when am I gonna have time to look after myself, right? And so this question comes of kind of setting boundaries and being able to give, but also, retaining that sort of space for ourselves. And I think this is, and I promise this is not a cop-out, okay? But it's really only a decision that we can make for ourselves, right? Because no one else can tell us, this is the point at which this is going to be too much for you. We are the only ones who can decide that, right? Like, we are the only ones who can decide how much capacity we have to give. And so what it requires actually is knowing ourselves well, right? Knowing ourselves in the sense, knowing our own mind, right? And knowing that, okay, when I get pushed past a certain point, then my capacity to love actually starts draining away. And therefore, I have to make sure that I don't get pushed past that certain point, right? At the same time, as spiritual seekers, it is also our kind of, what we want is to keep expanding our capacity, right? So it's then also for us to keep working on ourselves to make sure that we're not limiting that in any way, that we're working on ourselves so that we can try to keep giving more and more, but also knowing that, okay, if I do have a boundary here, then it's up to me to kind of make sure that I make that clear to the people around me, and make sure that I, enforce it in whatever way is appropriate.
So then, how do I go about, trying to find that balance? I mean, you talk a lot about really knowing oneself, and that, this is very like individual. But then how do I sort of, there is this desire to expand that capacity to love unconditionally, at the same time wanting to like set these boundaries, right? How do I find that balance? So how do people generally find that balance?
Through experience, I think, right? Like when we go through different situations and we have different experiences, all of those, like all experiences are an opportunity to learn something about ourselves, if we pay enough attention. And that's all it requires, right? We're constantly having experiences that do teach us something. The thing is just, are we paying attention to what it's teaching us? So it's both. It's kind of, on the one hand, regularly and consistently doing the introspection, right? To know our own mind and to recognize how it is that we are reacting to the world around us and to the people around us. But two, it's like trying, right? Like like Gurudev says in I Love You letters, like try and give love. See what happens. Just experiment, right? Because if we don't try, then we won't know. If we don't do something different, then we won't ever kind of, where's the opportunity for growth, right? So it is then also up to us to keep kind of finding different opportunities to give love.
So last week in class, we had just started talking about a topic, but then class was over. I had a question. I had a question.
Sorry about that.
I had a question. I've been waiting a week to ask you that.
Okay.
It's on the topic of love, but so what is the difference between love and devotion?
It's actually really simple. In that when we use the word devotion, it's love for the divine. We use the word love for anyone and anything. But devotion, particularly in our kind of context, is just that. It's love for the higher. It's love for the divine. And that ultimately is the goal of all of this, right? It is that we learn to love in such a way that we are completely sort of free from all limitations. Because one, we recognize the divine in ourselves and everyone. And that means that the love we offer to everyone is not limited, right? Because it's love for the higher. But yeah, that's the difference.
I love how I waited 1 week. Like,
one sentence.
Very simple.
That's it.
Those are all the questions
Okay.
that I had.
Great. So now we have time for questions for anyone in the room, but also if anyone online has questions. Yes, Kunal.
So the definition of love, does that the correlation between the amount one gives and the strength of love, does that apply in romantic relationships?
Yeah, it applies in whatever context that we're thinking about love. The measure is how much am I ready to give? The indication, which I don't think I said explicitly, but so there's two things, right? One is Gurudev says the indication of love is identification. So to what extent do I see myself in the other person, right? Or do I feel that, I'm one with them? And the measure is this, it's how much am I willing to give and to give up? Yeah, even in a relationship with a partner. Yeah.
When you say how much you're willing to give up, that means that you don't feel bad for giving up, right? Because it's one thing to say like, I'm willing to give up, but then you still think like, oh, I gave that up for them. So it's even dropping that emotion after the giving up.
Yeah, it's where it's where there is no hesitation, there is no regret, it's like as easily as I would give it up for myself, I would give it up for the other person, right? That easily. And that really, I think when we put it that way, then we start to recognize like how much we hesitate actually with a lot of the people in our life, right? As much as we do love them, we're so kind of trained to think about ourselves. But that's the ideal. Yeah. Yeah.
How would you know if something is divine or like devotion or if it's just love?
When that love is not limited. So for example, when you love a person, you can love that person completely, but you don't necessarily love their brother or sister, right? Whereas when you have love for the divine and the understanding that God is all and the divine is not limited in any way, then that love also becomes unlimited.
So it's like loving them for all their flaws.
Loving all
their flaws as well as their good stuff as well.
in devotion or just in love?
In devotion.
In devotion, it is when we think of devotion in the context of people, right? It is seeing beyond it's seeing beyond their kind of good qualities and their flaws to their essence and developing love for that, like for who they are at their core. That is then divine love. It's very subtle because what we're saying basically is that when we have devotion, then we love that divine truth which is present in all, right? But which is not defined by a person's personality, right? It's like even beyond the personality. And actually the same thing is true of love, right? That there's this common or this well-known kind of idea that love is not because of anything. Love is in spite of, right? So we don't love people because of a particular trait or because of something they've done or because of anything. It is in spite of, like you said, their flaws or whatever, we still are able to love them, identify with them, and have the capacity to kind of give. Yeah. Yes, was there a question here first? And then, Sam.
When you mentioned the indication of love is identification, so how much do I see myself in the other? Does that is that in the sense of how much are my needs and desires in line and aligned with the other individual? And if that's the case, then does that not play a role in accentuating the ego?
Yeah, it's not that I kind of see that there are similarities between us, right? It's seeing oneness. And what you mentioned, I think, is looking for what's common, right? So it's saying, okay, I have this goal in my life. This person also happens to have the same goal in their life. Great, we are, well matched or whatever. But that's still me very much holding on to my priorities and my goals, etc. Right? And on that basis, then I'm looking for a way to identify with that person. A really beautiful way of thinking about it that I think simplifies it a lot. One of the definitions that is given for love is it is being happy in the other person's happiness. Right? And so there it's not about it I'm sort of able to separate myself completely from that. Because then it's not about if we hold on to this thing of goals, right? It's if that person has achieved their goal, regardless of whether or not I have, if they are happy and content in their achievement, then I'm able to be happy for them and with them. So it's being happy in the happiness of the other, regardless of what makes me happy. Okay. Yeah, kind of.
Where does the concept of surrender fit in with love?
Where does the concept of surrender fit in with love? I think surrendering to love is where it comes in the sense that when we start to kind of actually practice giving love, then we recognize that it's the only way of relating to people that really makes sense as a spiritual seeker and just in general in life if I want to be happy, right? So I think surrender comes when we recognize that, and then we can let go of all our inhibitions and say that actually what if I actually just choose to love everyone, right? What if I surrender myself to love? That makes it so much easier. Of course, in our individual relationships also we're surrendering our ego in love, right? Because that's what we're giving up. So you can look at surrender in that way as well. In devotion also surrender plays a huge part, where we are recognizing like how sort of tiny we are in comparison to that all-pervading divinity. And therefore, again, surrender really of the ego is the only thing that makes sense. So surrender, plays a part in you can see it in different ways. But it definitely does have an important role. Anyone online? No questions, okay. We have time for,
So, like you mentioned about like you give, but then like your capacity. And then obviously, you want to challenge yourself as well. I think it's important that you challenge to give more. Then obviously you can't just say I'm limitless and then just start doing all sorts. I think you've got to like know your boundary. But then my question is, how do you know that? Like, how are you able to establish that now? So then what's the right level to challenge yourself.
It's just by trying, right? It's just by experimenting that we find our limits. That's how we find our limits in anything, right? Like how many gulab jamuns have you ever tried to eat in one sitting? I'm sure you've done this, Kishan, like you've experimented. You find your limit, right? Like you get to a point where you're like, okay, I physically cannot eat anymore. But you only find that limit because you sit down and try one day. I'm not suggesting that you do that with anything, right? So here also, like, if we just keep trying to give, we will find, like, we will discover what our so-called limits are, right? But again, like you said, and like we said earlier, the point is not to kind of just accept those limits, but to keep working to expand them, okay? Yes.
Can't really articulate this very well, that's fine, I've lost my train of thought, sorry.
Okay, we can come back.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
When it comes to bhakti, I'm trying to think less and feel more. How do I do that?
Just immerse yourself. In the sense, the way to develop love in any context is to build a connection, right? And so when we're talking about bhakti, we're talking about developing a relationship, a connection with the divine. And so the way to do that is to just like feed in as much as you can about God, right? And this is where it's helpful to, you know, have like an Ishta Devata, what we, you know, your particular, the form of God that you connect with the most, whatever it is, whether it's Devi or Shiva or Krishna, etc. And just, yeah, keep giving your mind food for thought, or not food for thought, but food to feel. So whether it's stories or it is just listening to the name, or it is listening to or looking at images, you know, just surrounding yourself and immersing yourself in everything to do with the divine. That, yeah, allowing ourselves to connect on a more kind of emotional level. It is also important that we understand who God is, right? That we also understand that when we develop love for a particular form, God is not limited to that form. And so we do also want to understand what is God's nature. So the understanding is important, but the emotional connection comes through, just spending time, right? And it's through, giving ourselves all that food for thought.
So we do have a question on chat.
Yes.
What does the work to expand your boundaries for love look like? What's the work you need to do?
The work is basically when you come up across a boundary, I think it's examining it and questioning whether it really is something that you cannot go past, or is it something that through practice you can overcome, right? So say, for example, you have a friend who every time you speak wants to tell you about their life and doesn't always, sometimes, but doesn't always ask you about your life. A lot of us, when we're in this type of relationship and we're giving and giving and giving and we're not receiving much in return, we'll kind of think, I'm not sure how much I want to invest here, right? Or how much do I want to sort of give? So then maybe it's just asking yourself, well, I don't know, does it really matter if they ask me about my life? How interesting is my life? Like, maybe they really don't want to hear about it. Or maybe I don't really need to tell them about it. And maybe right now in their life, they need more support. Can I be that person and just try and give? And very often when we consciously do it, what we find is actually that boundary is just one that we've constructed in our mind, right? And we don't really need we don't really need to like protect ourselves in that way, because really the boundaries are about protecting ourselves, okay? So it goes hand in hand with what we were talking about earlier about strengthening ourselves, empowering ourselves to give love, then makes us recognize that we can just give. Hopefully that answers the question. I can't see the person, so I don't know. Yes.
What's the difference between like giving a lot, but also like, but not being a pushover? How do you like differentiate yourself? Because like if you give too much, then you're kind of a pushover, right?
Yeah. So, I think it depends on the context, right? Like if you're in a work context, no one wants to be a pushover. Right? You want to be someone who's respected. But if you are, I don't know, at home with your family, right? Does it really matter if you're like a pushover? I don't know. I think also you can separate the two. Yeah, like there is a way of being like, of giving and just giving and giving, but also at the same time, not being a pushover. Being someone who has firm boundaries. Boundaries don't always have to be because we kind of can't function without them. You know what I mean? So the boundary can just be like a really practical thing where it is not because I will be hurt if someone crosses the boundary. It's just because I know that this situation requires me to act in a way that I'm establishing this boundary, right? Yeah. So you can, you can do both, I think. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, we are just out of time. So we're gonna, I think, pause here. I know that there is still maybe 1 or 2 questions left, but hopefully we'll have another opportunity to talk about them. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to everyone online. The next session will be the 3rd Wednesday of April. And that will be by Swami Avyayanandaji in Singapore. So please do register online if you would like to attend that. If you're in Singapore, then lucky for you. You can be there in person. Okay, we'll conclude with our closing prayers. Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Hari Om.